Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, governments and private debt. Time and time again, we hear about fiscal conservatism, balancing the books, even austerity to get the government budget back into surplus, because that's going to help the government pay off national debt, so they pay less in repayments and they have more money to spend on things that government spend money on. Now, regular listeners will know that's not exactly how things work out, but surely there is a need to keep that spending under control. But how much of it lately has involved passing spending onto individuals, like with student loans, for example? Instead of paying for a student's education, we get them to pay and reduce their spending on other stuff in the process. Isn't that just transferring responsibility while ensuring the finance sector gets a cut in the whole process? We'll look at government debt, private debt, and who gets involved in between today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Now, we are all racking up more and more debt. In theory, government debt and private debt should be interchangeable, shouldn't they, Steve? So when one goes up, the other goes down. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So much of that is due to government policy, which is sort of blurring the lines, isn't it, between public and private spending?
It's a complicated story. In fact, this is one where, like in general, the non-orthodox economic crowd, particularly modern monetary theory, says, the government debt doesn't matter, private debt's what you should focus upon. And generally speaking, I'm in that camp. But one point which Richard Vague, who's leads I think it's called the Debt Economics Project in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. One thing, he comes from a banker's point of view and just looks at the absolute data. And he makes the point that when you add together the two forms of debt, whatever you might say, one offsets the other, they've been rising over time. And just to give an idea of that, I've just plotted this data out of my combined Federal Reserve and Bank of International Settlements and the US Census data. If you go back to the earliest record date in which we have moderately reliable data. I had to do a bit of data interpolating to put this together. But you go back to 1834, the combined level of government and private debt was 50% of GDP. If you fast forward to 1875, which is about 40 years on, it's 65% of GDP. If you hit just after 1900, it's 85% of GDP. Then you go through the Great Depression, the Second World War, and it hits, I'll start with 1946, 150% of GDP. It then fell between the end of the Second World War and 1952 to 120% of GDP. And across that period, government debt was falling very rapidly, but private debt was rising. So it was actually a fall in government debt, counteracted by a small rise in private debt. That meant you got to 120% of GDP being the aggregate debt level in 1951. From 1951 right across to 1981, pretty much the two levels flatline. You have, again, for the whole period, you had falling government debt and rising private debt. Now, that's when it all gets interesting, because in 1982, and that tends to be a fairly significant date both in US and American data,
UK data, I mean. Yeah.
UK data and US data as well. That's when it's both started to rise. So from 1982, you had a rising level of government debt and a rising level of private debt. We then hit let's put this up on the blog post as part of the graphics for the whole thing. 1988, the rate of growth started to slow down. And that stage you had a bursting of a private debt bubble, and that led to falling private debt relative to government, the rate of GDP, even though private debt was still, generally speaking, rising at that stage. So 173% there. It then out to 2001, 188%. Now, since 2001, both private debt and government debt have most of the time been rising. You had a period of rising government debt and rising private debt until 2007, mainly private debt rising and government debt fluctuating a bit. Then since then, bang, it leapt up. And since 2011, but post the crisis, falling private debt has been offset by rising government debt. You now have a debt level of 251% of GDP. So what we've got in the aggregate sense, this is Richard Vague's point, it's increased by a factor of 5.
Yeah.
The debt, okay.
So the mix has changed, but it's always going up. So it's but as you said at the beginning, that government debt is less important than the private debt because private debt has to be repaid. And in the UK, households, I mean, some figures we had from the Office of National Statistics, collectively now, until last year, we haven't actually been spending, since I think in the 1988, actually, we haven't been spending more than we've been earning. But in 2017, net lending for the household sector was minus £22.6 billion. The last time that measure was negative was 1988. So we were in the UK, this surprised me, for that long period of time, living within our means. 1988.
I think I'm going to dispute that.
Well, this is what the ONS is saying. They're saying in 1988, the deficit was 394 million. Last year, it was 22.6 billion. But in between, they're saying, well, no, there was no. The net lending was not negative.
I'm wondering where this data is coming from, how much massaging this data has copped, and whether it had a happy ending. Because when I look at I'm looking at the data from the Bank of International Settlements now, which of course is taken from the Bank of England, of household debt in the UK and corporate debt in the UK, so breaking them both down. And what that implies is that the house sector has been net lending to the rest of the economy, which is the usual way this is seen. Households lend, corporations borrow, banks are intermediaries between the two. Does that ring any dangerous bells for you? Okay, from a post-Keynesian, endogenous money, real world part of it, that's not what households do at all. It's not what banks do at all. But looking at it, if that were true, you'd imagine that household debt would be falling, or your net assets would be rising. Net assets may be doing something different because of the inflation of the value of the housing sector. And that's what I think might be lying behind the data. It has been massaged to include the nominal value of household assets.
Right.
Because if I look at the level of household debt back in 1980 and for the pretty much 2 decades before, right back to 1967, household debt was 30% of GDP. Between 1980 and, 1993, it rose to 60% of GDP. And between 2000 and 2010, it rose to basically 100% of GDP.
But we've all got much more expensive houses, so we feel good about that. So
that's what I think's going on. They're treating it as if the assets and the liabilities are independent of each other. And what I know from doing the non-orthodox economic analysis in this and the statistics as well, what drives asset prices is the level of leverage. So if you try to net out the two, you might well find there's net lending going on. But let's go and see if everybody in England tries to sell its house tomorrow. What's the market price of those houses?
Yeah.
What the mistake we make is we try to work out the so-called value of assets by multiplying the number of houses by the marginal price. And this is one time I'll use the word marginal with the malice of forethought. The marginal seller. We value the entire housing stock as if the entire housing stock could be sold for the prices that roughly 5% get sold for every year, which is nonsense.
Yeah.
So it's just crazy to value the assets that way.
Well, we value companies the same way, of course. I mean, if everyone sold their shares in a company at the same time, then you'd only get a few percent in before the share price started to devalue, and the company is worth a lot less, of course. So the same thing applies.
The company would crash as well. Part of me being. If the economy would have a total plunge. So it's nonsense to use that as a valuation for assets. But that's what I'm sure is going on to come at the conclusion that the household sector has only just started net borrowing. When I look at the data again, what I can see is that in 2010, households went into actually repaying their debts. So that was not that they were doing it in any happy fashion, because that was the depth of the financial crisis. But at that stage, the change in household debt was minus 1.4% of GDP. It's now risen up to being plus 4% of GDP. So I think that that transition, that's because there's been an increase in borrowing without a great deal of change in house prices. And of course, we've seen some negative movements in house prices in London. And quite negative across the whole of the UK between 2010 and now. I think that's why it's poking up in the data, as the Office of National Statistics is saying household sectors are finally net borrowing rather than net lending.
Which is all well and good, but if we want to reduce private sector borrowing, do we need to increase government spending? And if we do that, isn't there a risk that the government will start doing stuff that the private sector is better at? We'll talk about that and a load of other stuff about the interplay between government and private debt and government and private spending in the full version of this podcast, which to hear, you need to subscribe. You can subscribe by going to debunkingeconomics.com and picking one of the subscription options in the right-hand column, or you can become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you pledge $10 or more support each month, which that money goes towards Steve's research into an alternative future for economics, $10 or more each month will give you access to this and all the other podcasts. There's well over 100 of them now in this series. So hopefully you'll do that, and we'll see you back here for the full version of this podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening this far.